What's going on, everybody? Today's video is going to be about inverted fullbacks, what they are, how to use them, often referred to as false fullbacks too. So before we start, check out my book. It's out. It's in the description below. So be sure to check that out. But let's get right into it. So first, we're going to break this video up into segments of thirds. So the first part of the video will be building from the back using the goalkeeper and how inverted fullbacks can play a role in this field division, then the midfield third, and then the final third, and so on. So right now we just have the basic shape. I'm going to use my tool here to highlight some spaces, and I'll highlight them in yellow. But here we have wide fullbacks out wide to start with, and then the most common one from here with a double pivot created by the 6 and the 8. Most common movement would just be the fullback to then move into this advanced area half space, and then for now the winger to be vacated on the width. And what this will do is it'll create a 4-man midfield as we see here. 4-man midfield to then offer diagonal passes from the first to the second line, and then continuing this diagonal passing into the half space into the advanced area. And now one of the reasons why we have a greater number of influence in the central corridors in the first third is one, to collapse the defense. So when we have this many players in the inverted fullback, oftentimes the winger, who usually uses the fullback as reference points, he'll come more narrow and have to defend deeper, as well as the rest of the midfield players in the defensive phase. So then what this will do is it'll allow access to the wide areas and easily progress the ball into the midfield third. But if this doesn't happen, if the midfielders stay wider, it often allows to then use the press against the team. It will allow us to attract the press and then use the numerical superiority to break the team using possession as a tool. So now we attract the press. Usually one will take his cover shadow out, then the other will stick on the weak side holding midfielder, and then we can attract the press using first line passes. And from here, if this doesn't elicit a jump from the opposing team's holding midfielders, but more often than not it will, because they'll have to make up numerical inferiority somehow, and usually they do this by trying to create positional advantages using cover shadows, but also having players jumping into higher areas. Now what this will do is it'll allow for the potential to exploit the use of a cover shadow with a third man movement around the cover shadow, and then from here, once we get into this platform on the half turn, as we see here, the ball could arrive, we get it on the half turn on his back foot, we have the opportunity to play diagonal passes into advanced areas to continue the breaking of the opposing's press. So here on the same side, this was via the number 10, but we can show this concept with the fullback as well, inverting into more of an advanced midfielder. So first we start off by attracting the press, first line passes, then the ball goes in back to the goalkeeper, attracting the press even further, and depending on which holding midfielder jumps, or if the winger jumps, we may even be able to play a vertical pass straight into the fullback to then initiate a third man concept to get a player in the pivot area on the ball facing forward to then spring the attack further forward. But if we have to go through a second route, let's say the 8 jumps, and we are allowed to play to the pivot on his back foot, attack can continue into the half space with the inverted fullback. But now let's look at a situation where the double pivot isn't just naturally created by a 6 and an 8. So now the inverted fullback will play with the role, and the timing of this inversion is really important in a few situations. So here's one. So when the inverted fullback comes inside, then the space is vacated, and if this fullback does this before or during the press of the opponent, so if the opponent presses and now the player inverts, he can become free, or if he does this before the press, so if he inverts, he can even pull the pressing player more narrow than he wants to be to then have to press from a different angle, which will then allow routes of progression for the opposing team to then play into the wide area. and then allow easy progression again into the midfield third. So the shape looks very similar in this one as well, just the different players occupying different roles. But we still have our 4-man midfield and having our good number numerically controlling the central 3 corridors, preparing for transition and disrupting the opposing team's defensive shape. Now for the last one, we can even go even more drastic with the occupation of these central players. So if we think about things more radical, this would be one of them. If the first line pass is played, maybe now we have our 10 inverting and our 6 now jumping to the weak side in the advanced area, occupying a more advanced role. So now we have a 3-man numerical advantage against their 2 holding midfielders here. I can even highlight this. So here's our 3v2 highlighted, but now we have no players in the pivot area, and this can come from out to in. So if we think of a lot of pressing strategies, these players, the forwards, will now not have anyone to use their cover shadow against, and the players pressing will then still use their cover shadows to block the fullbacks. But now if the fullbacks invert, we have the numerical superiority through the center of the field because our fullbacks are now the double pivot occupying the 2 forwards, and now the space in the wide area is controlled by our wingers. Now it depends how the defense reacts to this. If the wingers then drop a bit deeper to then have better access to the wingers of the team in possession, or if they stay high to then create a higher line of pressure in terms of getting access to the ball. But either way, this is then caused by the inversion of our 2 fullbacks now creating our double pivot, and it creates more space for the wingers to then create opportunity for a more controlled mid-range pass. And with the height and the numerical superiority we possess, they'll be more likely defenders will jump, which will then put an importance on our forward to then move to one side, pinning defenders and then creating overloads to then access this numerical superiority.